In the heart of the city's concrete shadows lived a young woman named Nyah Turner. To the elite she served and the bustling crowds she navigated daily, she was a ghost, a girl whose face was designed to blend into the background. From the outside, her life seemed unremarkable, just a cycle of quiet labor and long commutes. But inside the crumbling block apartment she called home, a much darker reality unfolded, one heavy with the suffocating scent of yesterday's fears and tomorrow's debts. Nyah didn't wake up to an alarm. She woke up to the sound of silence, the terrifying kind. It was 5:00 a.m., and she immediately checked on her younger sister Maya, whose breathing was shallow in the cold room. The apartment walls were weeping with dampness, and the floorboards creaked under Nyah's weight as she navigated around the buckets catching leaks from the ceiling. In the kitchen, she opened the fridge to find nothing but half a carton of watered-down milk and a single heel of bread. On the scarred wooden table sat the enemy, a stack of red-stamped eviction notices. They were 3 months behind, and the landlord's threats weren't just words anymore. They were a countdown. Nyah looked at her worn-out shoes, the soles thin as paper, and felt the crushing weight of a $50,000 debt she could never hope to pay. But today was different. A last-minute opening had appeared for a maid service at the Grand Imperial Gala. The one-night pay was enough to stall the landlord for a month, a desperate lifeline Nyah had to grab. She pulled on her red and white maid uniform, hand-scrubbed until her knuckles bled, and smoothed her messy hair. Her neighbor, an old woman who knew the city's secrets, stopped her at the door. "Be careful at the Imperial, Nyah," she whispered. "That place belongs to the Choi family. They don't see people like us as human. To them, we are just things to be used or broken." Nyah forced a determined nod. "It's just one night. I'll be back with the rent," she promised, a vow she had made so many times it felt like a prayer. 2 hours later, Nyah stood in a line of 40 workers in the cold, sterile service tunnel of the hotel. The floor manager, a man with eyes like flint, paced before them. "You are not guests. You are tools," he snapped. "One broken glass, one misplaced word, and you aren't just fired, you're erased." He stopped in front of Nyah, eyeing her desperate expression. You're on the head table. You will serve the guest of honor personally." Nyah's heart hammered against her ribs. The guest of honor was Hyun-Woo Choi. Everyone knew the name, the devil of the underground. The man who controlled the city's pulse with an iron fist and a cold heart. Serving him was like walking into a lion's den with nothing but a tray. Nyah lowered her gaze, making her face a mask of invisibility. She told herself she would be a shadow. She would make no mistakes. She would survive the night. She had no idea that in just a few hours, she wouldn't be serving the devil. She would be striking him. If you want to see how a girl with nothing became the only person a Mafia King could trust, and the shocking way he repaid her blow, like this video and subscribe for the full story. The cold air of the city's forgotten block was a thief, stealing the warmth from Nyah's lungs before she could even take a full breath. She sat at her small, scarred kitchen table, the silence of the apartment pressing against her ears like a physical weight. In the next room, the rhythmic, whistling breath of her younger sister, Maya, was the only thing keeping the encroaching darkness at bay. Nyah stared at the stack of papers before her. They weren't just documents. They were a death sentence printed on cheap cardstock. The eviction notice sat on top, the red ink of the final demand glowing like an open wound under the flickering overhead light. 3 months. That was how far they had fallen behind. $50,000 in accumulated debt, a mountain built from Maya's medical bills and the predatory interest of local lenders, loomed over her, impossible to climb. She reached for a glass of water, but the tap only yielded a hollow groan from the pipes and a few rusty drops. The water had been shut off yesterday. A sharp ache formed in her chest, a familiar companion she had learned to name as desperation. Every morning was a calculation of survival, which bill could be ignored, which meal could be skipped, and how many miles she could walk to save a bus fare. Nyah stood and walked to the cracked mirror in the hallway. She looked at her reflection, the fraying red and white uniform of the maid service, the dark circles beneath her eyes that no amount of cold water could wash away. She looked like a girl who was disappearing, a shadow thinning out until there was nothing left. "Just one more day," she whispered to the empty hallway. The gala shift at the Grand Imperial was her last gamble. It was a world she didn't belong in, a place where the floor wax cost more than her yearly rent. But the triple-time pay for the high-stakes VIP service was the only thing standing between them and the street. She had heard the stories of the men who frequented the Imperial, men like Hyun-Woo Choi who viewed the city as a chessboard and people like her as pawns to be discarded. She leaned over Maya's bed, tucking the thin, moth-eaten blanket around her sister's shoulders. Maya stirred, her eyes fluttering open for a brief second. "Are you going?" she murmured, her voice thick with sleep. "I'm going to fix it, Maya," Nyah promised, though the words felt like ash in her mouth. "I'll bring back enough for the rent. I'll bring back enough for everything." As she stepped out of the apartment and into the gray, unforgiving morning of the block, the weight of the silence followed her. She adjusted her collar, hiding the stain on her sleeve, and began the long walk toward the lights of the city. She would be a ghost tonight. She would be wallpaper. She would do whatever it took to survive the devil, never imagining that by the time the sun rose again, she would be the only one who had dared to touch him. The transition from the gray, crumbling streets of the block to the soaring glass towers of the city center felt like crossing into another dimension. As Nyah stood before the Grand Imperial Hotel, the sheer scale of the architecture made her feel smaller than ever. The building was a monolith of black marble and gold, glowing with a light so bright it seemed to push the very night back. This was the Devil's Palace, a place where the air itself felt expensive, filtered and chilled to perfection. As she entered through the service entrance, the grid of her neighborhood was stripped away by a sterile, high-pressure environment. She was ushered through a labyrinth of stainless steel and white tile, where an army of workers moved with the silent efficiency of a machine. Her worn uniform was inspected by a supervisor whose eyes were as cold as the marble in the lobby. Without a word, he straightened her collar with a sharp, painful tug and handed her a tray of crystal flutes. "Floor 32, VIP lounge. Do not look the guests in the eye. To them, you are furniture that breathes." When the service elevator doors slid open on the top floor, the cold beauty of the elite hit her like a physical blow. The ballroom was a sea of shimmering silks, tailored wool, and diamonds that caught the light like fallen stars. The scent was a dizzying mix of vintage champagne and perfumes that cost more than Nyah's apartment. But beneath the elegance, there was an edge, a predatory stillness that made the hair on the back of her neck stand up. She moved through the crowd, her head bowed just enough to appear submissive while her senses remained painfully sharp. The guests laughed and toasted, their voices melodic and cruel, discussing millions of dollars as if they were spare change. Then the room seemed to go quiet, the atmosphere shifting as if the oxygen had been sucked out of the air. Hyun-Woo Choi had entered the room. He didn't walk so much as he reclaimed the space around him. Dressed in a black suit that looked like it was woven from shadows, he moved with a controlled, lethal grace. His face was a masterpiece of stone-sharp cheekbones, a straight nose, and eyes that seemed to see through the glamour to the rot beneath. He radiated a terrifying authority, a man who didn't need to raise his voice to be heard. As Nyah approached the head table with her tray, her hands trembled almost imperceptibly. He was the sun around which this dark world orbited, and she was just a speck of dust caught in his gravity. She reached for a glass to serve him, her heart thundering against her ribs. She was deep in the heart of the palace now, surrounded by the beautiful and the damned, unaware that within these golden walls, her life was about to shatter and begin anew. The golden luster of the ballroom began to feel like a cage as Nyah moved toward the head table. Her hands were steady, but her heart was a frantic bird trapped against her ribs. She was a shadow among giants, moving through a thicket of expensive perfumes and whispered secrets. At the center of the orbit sat Hyun-Woo Choi, his presence a dark anchor in the sea of light. Beside him was his fiancée, Sora, a woman whose beauty was as sharp and cold as a diamond, her eyes never once landing on Nyah as she reached for a fresh glass. Nyah leaned in to replace a spent flute, her movements practiced and invisible. But as she reached for the bottle of vintage champagne resting in the silver ice bucket, her fingers brushed against something that didn't belong. It was a tiny, jagged edge of paper. She hesitated, her breath hitching, and glanced down. Hidden on the underside of the bottle's neck was a small, neon-green circular sticker, no larger than a ladybug. Her blood turned to ice. She remembered a hushed, frantic conversation she had overheard in the service hallway just moments before, two men in dark suits, their voices low and jagged with malice. They had spoken of the green mark and a permanent toast. At the time, she had dismissed it as the jargon of a world she didn't understand, but seeing the sticker now, positioned specifically for the bottle meant for the head table, the pieces clicked together with a terrifying snap. She looked at Hyun-Woo. He was leaning back, his expression unreadable, watching the room with the detached boredom of a king. He was a man who lived by the sword, yet he was moments away from being unmade by a single sip. Nyah's gaze shifted to Sora. The woman was watching the waiter approach with the tray of poured glasses, her knuckles white as she gripped her silk clutch. There was a hunger in her eyes that had nothing to do with celebration. The waiter, a man Nyah hadn't seen in the briefing, began to pour. The liquid bubbled, golden and innocent, filling the crystal glass that sat directly in front of Hyun-Woo. As the effervescence settled, Nyah saw it, a slight, oily film swirling on the surface before disappearing into the clarity of the wine. The green sticker wasn't just a label, it was a death warrant disguised as luxury. Nyah felt the world begin to tilt. She was a nobody from the block, a girl who lived in a room with moldy walls. If she spoke, she was dead. If she stayed silent, she was a murderer. The waiter stepped back, his task complete. Hyun-Woo's hand, large and steady, reached out for the stem of the glass. The air in the room seemed to thicken, the music fading into a dull roar as the devil of the underground prepared to drink his final toast. The air in the VIP lounge suddenly felt thin, as if the luxury surrounding Nyah was stripping the oxygen from her lungs. She stood frozen, a tray of crystal glasses balanced precariously in her hand, watching the scene unfold with a clarity that felt like a curse. To her left, the man known as the devil of the underground was closing his fingers around the stem of the poisoned glass. To her right, Sora, his fiancée, leaned in with a predatory grace, her smile as fixed and artificial as the diamonds at her throat. Nyah's gaze flickered to the shadows behind the head table, where Hyun-Woo's most trusted associate stood. The man's eyes weren't on the crowd or the security perimeter. They were locked onto the glass in Hyun-Woo's hand. In that moment, the VIP service became a gallery of vipers. These were the people who slept in his mansions and sat at his right hand, yet they were watching him walk into a grave with the patient hunger of scavengers. The injustice of it burned in Nyah's chest, hotter than the shame of her poverty. She was a girl who had spent her life bowing her head, apologizing for the space she occupied and praying to remain unnoticed. If she stayed invisible now, she would survive the night. She could take her paycheck, pay the landlord, and pretend she hadn't watched a man die. But as she looked at Hyun-Woo, a man who was feared by the entire city but was currently being betrayed by the only people he trusted, she realized that staying silent was its own kind of death. She thought of Maya, sleeping in their cold apartment, waiting for a sister who promised to make things right. Could she look her sister in the eye knowing she had let a murder happen for the sake of a rent check? The internal struggle was a violent storm. Every instinct honed by years of survival screamed at her to step back, to melt into the wallpaper, to let the powerful destroy one another. Hyun-Woo began to lift the glass to his lips. A hush fell over the immediate circle as the conspirators held their collective breath. Nyah's vision tunneled. The world narrowed down to that single, tainted flute of champagne and the hand that held it. She wasn't a warrior or a hero. She was just a maid from the block with a stained uniform and a heart that refused to go numb. The fear was still there, paralyzing and cold, but beneath it, a reckless, desperate spark of justice flared to life. She realized she couldn't live as a ghost if it meant letting the devils win. As Hyun-Woo's lips touched the rim, Nyah took a step forward, shattering her invisibility forever. The transition from invisible servant to active participant happened in a heartbeat, a violent rupture in the carefully manicured silence of the VIP lounge. As the crystal rim touched Hyun-Woo's lips, the world seemed to slow, the golden bubbles in the glass dancing like tiny, mocking stars. Nyah didn't think. If she had, the paralyzing terror of who he was would have kept her feet glued to the floor. Instead, she moved on raw, jagged instinct. She lunged forward, her empty tray clattering to the marble floor with a deafening ring as she threw her entire weight into a desperate, unrefined strike. Her fist connected with the side of Hyun-Woo's jaw with a sickening thud. The impact sent a jolt of pain up her arm, but it achieved its frantic purpose. The poisoned glass flew from his hand, arching through the air like a dying bird before shattering against a gold-leafed pillar. The sound of the breaking crystal was like a gunshot. The ballroom froze. The music seemed to die mid-note. For a moment, the only sound was Nyah's ragged, terrified breathing. She stood there, her body leaning forward, her hair falling over her face in messy tangles, her chest heaving. She was a girl from the block in a stained uniform, and she had just struck the most dangerous man in the city in front of his entire empire. Hyun-Woo's head had snapped to the side from the force of the blow. He didn't fall, he didn't even stumble. He slowly turned his face back toward her, his expression a mask of terrifying, unnatural calm. There was a red mark blooming on his cheekbone, a stark contrast to his pale, aristocratic skin. His eyes, dark and bottomless, locked onto hers with a lethal intensity that made her knees want to buckle. "You." Sora's voice broke the silence, high and shrill, vibrating with a mixture of shock and hidden fury. "Security, kill her, she tried to assassinate him." In an instant, the predatory stillness of the room vanished. Two massive guards in black suits descended on Nyah, their movements blurred by speed. One gripped her arms, wrenching them behind her back until she cried out, while the other forced her down to her knees. Her forehead pressed against the cold marble, the very floor she had been hired to keep clean. Nyah looked up through the curtain of her hair, her eyes wide and wet with tears of pure terror. She saw the vipers closing in, their faces twisted in faux outrage to hide their disappointment that the poison hadn't reached its mark. She saw the shattered remains of the glass just inches away, the liquid seeping into the grout. And then she saw Hyun-Woo. He stood over her, silhouetted against the brilliant chandeliers, looking down at the girl who had dared to touch the untouchable. He didn't look angry. He looked like a god deciding which way the wind should blow. Nyah closed her eyes, certain that the last thing she would ever feel was the cold weight of the devil's judgment. The descent into the bowels of the Grand Imperial was a blur of concrete stairs and the harsh, rhythmic thud of heavy boots. The guards didn't speak. They handled Nyah like a piece of refuse being cleared after a party, her feet barely touching the ground as they dragged her into the service basement. Here, the gold and silk of the ballroom were replaced by cold cinder blocks and the low, industrial hum of the hotel's cooling system. They threw her into a metal chair in the center of a damp, dimly lit storage room, the scent of stale air and cleaning chemicals filling her lungs. The door groaned on its hinges, and the atmosphere in the room shifted instantly. Hyun-Woo Choi stepped into the light, his silhouette cutting a sharp, lethal figure against the shadows. He had discarded his suit jacket, his white shirt sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms corded with tension. He didn't look like a man who had just been attacked. He looked like a predator who had finally found something worth investigating. He stopped inches from her, the red mark on his jaw now a deep, angry purple. For a long moment, he simply stared at her, his silence more terrifying than any scream. "In my world," he began, his voice a low, melodic silk that made her shiver, "people die for far less than what you did tonight. Give me one reason why I shouldn't let my men finish what you started." Nyah's voice was trapped in her throat, her chest tight with a fear that felt like drowning. She looked up at him, her eyes stinging. "The glass," she rasped, her voice cracking. "The bottle, it had a green sticker, on the neck, underneath." Hyun-Woo's eyes narrowed, a flicker of something, curiosity or perhaps a darker suspicion crossing his face. "I heard them," Nyah continued, the words tumbling out in a desperate rush. "In the hallway, they spoke about a permanent toast and a green mark. Your fiancé, your friend. They weren't watching the party, they were watching you drink. There was an oily film on the wine, it wasn't just champagne, it was a grave." She expected him to laugh or perhaps to strike her back. Instead, Hyun-Woo remained perfectly still. He reached out, his thumb and forefinger catching her chin, forcing her to look directly into the bottomless depths of his gaze. He was searching for a lie, for the tremor of a spy or the calculation of an assassin. But all he found was the raw, trembling honesty of a girl who had nothing left to lose but her soul. "If you are lying," he whispered, his breath warm against her cold skin, "you will pray for a quick end. But if you are right—" He let go of her chin, his expression hardening into something far more dangerous than anger. He turned to the shadows where his lead enforcer stood. "Check the glass fragments, and bring me the guest list for the service staff." Nyah slumped in the chair, the shadows of the basement closing in around her. She had told the truth, but in the world of the devil, the truth was often the most dangerous weapon of all. The silence in the basement was broken only by the sharp, rhythmic clicking of a tablet as Hyun-Woo's head of security approached. Nyah remained huddled in the metal chair, her breath hitching as the man whispered to his boss. On the screen, high-resolution footage from the service hallway played in a loop. Sora, the elegant fiancé, handing a small vial to the right-hand man Min-ho, who had served at Hyun-Woo's side for over a decade. The betrayal was not a moment of passion. It was a calculated architecture of greed that had been building for years. Hyun-Woo's face didn't redden with rage. Instead, it became terrifyingly pale, his eyes turning into shards of ice. He signaled for the guards to bring the conspirators down. When the heavy steel doors groaned open again, Sora and Min-ho were pushed into the room. They still wore their gala finery, Sora in her shimmering silk gown and Min-ho in his sharp tuxedo, but the glamour was gone, replaced by the frantic, sweating desperation of trapped animals. Sora's gaze darted to Nyah, her lips curling in a snarl. "You're going to believe this? This trash? This gutter girl?" Hyun-Woo didn't answer. He walked to a small table where a technician had placed the shattered fragments of the champagne glass. Under a localized UV light, a neon green residue glowed like a curse. He then pulled a small, circular green sticker from a plastic evidence bag, the one Nyah had seen under the bottle's neck. 10 years, Min-ho, Hyun-Woo said, his voice a low, vibrating hum that seemed to rattle the very walls. "I gave you my trust, and you gave me a sticker and a vial of neurotoxin." Min-ho fell to his knees, his composure shattering. "She promised me half, Hyun-Woo. She said you were becoming soft." Sora let out a strangled cry, reaching for Hyun-Woo's arm, but he stepped back as if her touch were a contagion. "The only thing that was soft," he whispered, looking at the bruise Nyah had left on his jaw, "was my belief that loyalty existed in this room. Until tonight." He didn't scream or issue a dramatic sentence. He simply looked at his security team and nodded toward the deep shadows of the back corridor, the place from which no one returned. As they were dragged away, their screams echoing and then abruptly muffled by the heavy doors, the room fell into a heavy, ringing silence. Hyun-Woo stood alone in the center of the basement, the weight of a decade's worth of lies settling on his shoulders. He turned slowly toward Nyah. She was still trembling, her red and white uniform stained with sweat and marble dust, the most invisible person in the building. He looked at the girl who had nothing, yet had risked her life to give him the truth that his closest allies had tried to kill. For the first time, the devil of the underground didn't see a maid. He saw a miracle. He walked toward her, his footsteps soft on the concrete. "Nyah," he said, and the way he spoke her name made the cold basement feel, for a fleeting moment, like a sanctuary. The transition from the terrifying shadows of the basement to the weeks that followed felt like waking from a fever dream into a reality Nyah never dared to imagine. She no longer woke to the sound of dripping pipes or the suffocating silence of a house filled with yesterday's fears. Instead, the world seemed to have expanded, the walls of her life pushed back by a hand she once thought was only capable of destruction. Hyun-Woo Choi did not simply thank her. He systematically dismantled the cage of poverty that had held her family captive for years. The mountain of debt, the $50,000 that had felt like an anchor dragging her into the depths, was erased with a single stroke of his pen. The predatory lenders who had haunted her doorstep vanished, replaced by a security team that ensured no shadow ever touched her block again. One morning, Nyah stood in the center of a sun-drenched apartment overlooking the city, a place far removed from the mold and the dampness of her old life. She watched through a doorway as Maya sat at a desk, surrounded by new books and a laptop, her eyes bright with a focus Nyah hadn't seen in years. Hyun-Woo had not only moved them, he had enrolled Maya in the most prestigious private academy in the state, securing the education they had once whispered about as if it were a fairy tale. Nyah looked down at her hands. They were no longer red and raw from scrubbing floors or trembling with the fear of an impending eviction. She was no longer a ghost, a girl designed to blend into the wallpaper of the elite. For the first time in her life, she felt seen. Hyun-Woo appeared in the doorway, his presence no longer radiating the cold, predatory stillness of the Grand Imperial. He watched Maya for a moment before his gaze settled on Nyah. There was a quiet intensity in his eyes, a respect that had been earned in the blood and shattered glass of the gala. "You saved my life, Nyah," he said softly, his voice a low vibration in the quiet room. "The debt isn't yours anymore. It's mine." Nyah realized then that she wasn't just a maid who had gotten lucky. She was a woman who had stood her ground when the rest of the world bowed, and in doing so, she had found the only man in the city who valued truth over power. The invisibility that had been her shield and her prison was gone, replaced by a new, terrifying, and beautiful light. She wasn't a shadow anymore. She was the girl who had struck the devil, and in return, he had given her the world. The rooftop of the Imperial was a sanctuary of glass and steel, suspended high above the glittering, restless veins of the city. A light breeze carried the distant hum of New York, but up here, surrounded by the fragrance of night-blooming jasmine and the soft glow of lanterns, the world felt still. Nyah stood by the railing, her silk dress catching the moonlight. She looked down at the streets below, the same streets where just months ago she had walked with holes in her shoes and a heart full of yesterday's fears. "I went back there," a low, familiar voice murmured behind her. Nyah turned to find Hyun-Woo stepping out from the shadows. He wasn't the devil tonight. The sharp, lethal edge of the mafia boss had softened into something profoundly human. "To the block," he continued, standing beside her. "I walked through that hallway. I saw the mold on the walls. I felt the cold that doesn't leave, no matter how many blankets you use." Nyah's breath hitched. "Why?" "Because I needed to understand," he said, his dark eyes searching hers. "I spent my life thinking power was about how many people bowed to you. But then I met a girl who refused to bow. A girl who had nothing, yet risked her life to save a man who hadn't given her a second glance. I had to see the place that forged that kind of courage." He reached out, his fingers brushing against the hand that had once punched him, the hand that had shattered the glass and his world along with it. "You weren't invisible, Nyah. You were the only light in that room. I just didn't have the eyes to see it yet." The city lights reflected in his gaze as he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. He didn't hesitate. The man who controlled the city's pulse dropped to one knee, the movement deliberate and graceful. When he opened the box, a diamond larger and brighter than any star in the sky caught the light. "You saved my life, and in doing so, you gave me a soul," Hyun-Woo whispered, his voice thick with an emotion he had spent a lifetime hiding. "I don't want to be the king of this city if you aren't the queen by my side. Nyah Turner, will you stay with me? Not as a shadow, but as my equal." Tears blurred Nyah's vision, hot and sweet. She thought of the red stamp notices, the hunger, and the girl who had been a ghost. That girl was gone. In her place stood a woman who was loved by the man the world feared most. "Yes," she breathed, her voice a steady vow that cut through the night air. As he slid the ring onto her finger and drew her into a kiss, the distance between the block and the palace vanished. The devil had found his heart, and the invisible girl had finally truly been seen.